The day I needed help, my own son told me, "You are no longer my problem, Dad," and threw me out on the street like I was garbage. I swallowed the humiliation, the abandonment, and the contempt. I stayed quiet, but that silence hid a decision that would put everyone on alert. Because what my son did not know was that I was not simply a weak old man begging for charity. And when the truth came to light, it would be too late for any regrets. My name is Robert Miller. I am 84 years old, and I live alone in a small town in upstate New York. One of those places where everyone knows each other by their last name and family history. Willow Creek, to be exact, a town where colonial houses hold centuries of stories, where the Tuesday market has operated in the same square since before the Revolution, and where Bill the baker knows your name and your favorite pastry before you even open your mouth. For decades, I was respected as a discreet, hard-working man, the kind who never complains and always keeps his word. I raised my son, Mike, believing that the care would be returned when age took its toll. I believed the values I tried to teach him had taken deep roots. How wrong was I? My wife Grace died 7 years ago. Breast cancer that spread too fast, despite all the treatments in Boston. When she left, she took with her not only 52 years of marriage, but also the last person who looked at me with genuine affection. We were left alone, me and the empty house, me and the memories echoing in the silent rooms. Mike came to the funeral, of course. He arrived from New York City with his wife, Sarah. He stayed 2 days helping with the necessary paperwork and returned to his busy life in the city. After that, the visits became increasingly rare and the phone calls shorter and shorter until they practically disappeared. But my body really started to fail last winter. My legs no longer obeyed like before, especially the left one, which seemed to have developed a mind of its own, trembling and giving out at the most inconvenient times. The cold, upstate New York nights, which I used to face without a problem, became too long to handle alone. I would wake up at 3 in the morning with terrible cramps, and it took almost an hour for them to pass. The arthritis in my knees and hips turned every movement into a painful negotiation. Going down the stairs to make coffee in the morning had become a dangerous expedition. Taking a shower required planning and courage. Putting on my socks seemed like an impossible task some days. The town doctor, Dr. Adams, a 60-year-old man who had known me for decades, was blunt during my last visit. He sat in his old office chair, took off his glasses, and looked me in the eye with that brutal honesty that only old friends can afford. He told me I should no longer live alone, that a fall could be fatal at my age, that I needed someone nearby, at least for basic activities. He recommended that I talk to my son, that I look for family help before considering a nursing home. That was when Robert Miller swallowed his pride, and I did what I never imagined I would have to do. I picked up the phone and called Mike to ask for help. The conversation was brief. I explained the situation, the difficulties, and the doctor's advice. There was a silence on the other end of the line, then Sarah's voice in the background saying something I could not make out. Mike came back and said he had to think about it, that he would talk to his wife, that he would call me back. 2 days later, he called saying I could go to New York City to stay with them for a while as we figured out the situation. I packed a small suitcase with clothes for a week, maybe 2. I asked my neighbor, Frank, to take care of the garden and collect the mail. I locked the house that Grace and I had turned into a home for over half a century and left. I took the express bus from Willow Creek, 4 hours to New York City, thinking that maybe, finally, my son would show the compassion I always believed I had planted in him. The apartment was on the Upper East Side, near the park, an impressive address, the kind that costs a fortune. Mike worked as a financial director for a tech company. He made good money, very good money from what I could tell. The apartment was modern, minimalist, entirely decorated in white and gray tones, with designer furniture that looked more like artwork than objects for use. Everything was impeccably clean, everything in its place, everything screaming, "Do not touch anything, Sarah received me with a tense smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes. She showed me the guest room, small but comfortable, and said dinner would be at 8. During the first few days, I tried to make myself useful. I offered to help in the kitchen, to do small chores. Sarah politely declined, saying I was a guest, that I should rest, but I saw in her eyes, in the way she twisted her lips when she thought I was not looking, that my presence was a nuisance. Mike would get home late from work, eat dinner quickly. He would disappear into the study or into bed. Conversations were minimal, functional, empty of any real warmth. 1 week passed, then 2. I asked questions about the plans, about when we could discuss long-term solutions. Mike always evaded the topic. He said he was very busy, that we would talk over the weekend. But the weekend would arrive, and he would find commitments, outings, excuses. I began to notice the exchanged glances between him and Sarah, the whispered conversations that stopped the moment I entered the room. The tension in the apartment grew like a storm cloud, heavy and threatening. It was a Thursday afternoon, almost a month after my arrival, that everything fell apart. I was in the living room reading the newspaper when Mike got home from work earlier than usual. Sarah was also home, which was rare. They exchanged a look, the kind shared by people who have already discussed something 1,000 times and finally reached a decision. My son sat on the armchair across from me. Sarah stood right next to him, her arms crossed like a guard. Mike took a deep breath and then began. He said the situation was not working out, that the apartment was too small for 3 people, that they had their own lives, their own responsibilities, that I had to understand he could not simply drop everything to take care of me. His voice was firm, rehearsed, as if he were giving a business presentation. Sarah nodded beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line of approval. I tried to argue calmly. I said I did not expect them to give up their lives, only to help me find a solution, that maybe we could hire someone to help me in Willow Creek, or look for a good nursing home in the area, that I did not want to be a burden. I just needed support to make those decisions, to navigate the healthcare bureaucracy that becomes a maze when you are over 80 years old. That was when Sarah spoke for the first time since the conversation began. Her voice had that cutting tone of someone finally saying what they had always thought. "Robert, let us be honest. You lived your life. You made your choices. You cannot expect that now, when you are old and sick, we will drop everything to solve your problems. We have our own projects, our own future to build." I looked at my son, waiting for him to intervene, to say something, but Mike remained quiet. His eyes turned away from mine, studying some spot on the wall. Then I asked, my voice still calm despite the knot in my chest, "And what do you suggest I do?" There was a heavy silence. Sarah looked at Mike as if waiting for him to take the reins, but it was her who continued, her voice now colder, more final. "There are institutions that take care of people in your situation, places where you will have all the necessary assistance. We can help you look for an appropriate place, obviously, but we cannot, and we will not, turn our house and our lives into a hospital." Institutions, places. She spoke about me as if I were an object to be deposited in a convenient storage unit. I looked at Mike again, searching in his eyes for some remains of the boy I had raised, of the young man who used to hug me when he came home from school, of the boy who had cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke up with him. But the eyes looking back at me were those of a stranger, cold and distant. "Mike," I said, my voice beginning to tremble for the first time, "I'm your father." He looked away again, his jaw clenched. He ran his hand through his hair in a gesture of impatience that I recognized from his childhood. That movement he always made when he was uncomfortable but determined to go through with something. "I know who you are," he replied, his voice low but firm. "But that does not change the fact that we do not have the conditions to take care of you. Not now. Not like this." As if there were another way, a scenario where he would be willing to help his own father. But I knew in that moment, I felt it with absolute clarity, that there was no such scenario, that my son had made his decision, and nothing I said would change that. That day, sitting at their kitchen table the morning after that brutal conversation, I heard the words I will never forget. Mike was drinking his coffee, dressed for work, checking emails on his phone. I had spent the entire night awake, thinking, wondering how it had come to this. I gathered my courage and tried one more time. I asked if we could at least discuss alternatives, look for solutions together. That was when he looked up from his phone and said, with a coldness that cut deeper than any knife, "You are no longer my problem, Dad." The phrase came out dry, without anger, without emotion, just a fact being stated, like someone saying it is going to rain or that the subway is delayed. Then the order delivered with the same indifference. I had to pack my bag and leave before the end of the day. They had booked a room in a modest hotel near the downtown bus terminal. For 3 nights, enough time for me to get organized. After that, I was on my own. There was no room for explanations or for memories of the past. The house where he was born, where I changed his diapers, where I spent sleepless nights when he was sick, where I celebrated every birthday, every achievement, was no longer relevant. That incredibly expensive apartment on the Upper East Side, bought in part with the money I had lent him years ago for the down payment, no longer had space for the old man who had raised him. Robert Miller did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just listened. I looked down at the cold cup of coffee in front of me, and I just felt it. I got up slowly, felt every single one of my 84 years weigh on my aching knees, and went to the guest room to pack my bag. The humiliation, the abandonment, and the contempt weighed more than the suitcase in my trembling hands. When I left the apartment 2 hours later, Mike had already gone to work. Sarah handed me an envelope with the hotel address and money for the cab, a barely concealed smile of relief on her lips. Anyone watching from the outside would have thought that this hunched old man dragging a worn-out suitcase had simply accepted the end. But what no one noticed was the silence. I spent those 3 nights at the downtown hotel, a place with thin walls where you could hear every noise from the neighboring rooms, with a lingering smell of dampness and cheap cleaning products. Lying on that hard bed, staring at the stained ceiling, I made a decision. It would not be an impulsive decision. It would not be driven by anger or revenge. It would be a cold, calculated, just decision, a decision my son and his wife had forced upon me with their careless cruelty. On the 4th day, I returned to Willow Creek. I took the bus back, watched the upstate landscape pass by the window without really seeing it, my mind too occupied with plans and possibilities. Frank, my neighbor, was surprised to see me return so soon, carrying the same suitcase I had left with. I thanked him for taking care of the house. I said things had not worked out in the city as expected, and I walked into the empty and silent house that now felt more welcoming than ever. Back in the small town, Robert kept his routine. I greeted the neighbors at the bakery in the morning. I bought my pastries and my newspaper. I sat on the same bench in the main square, under the centennial oak tree, watching life go by. I had coffee at the local diner at the same time. 3 in the afternoon, a black coffee and a glass of water. On the outside, absolute calm. The neighbors, accustomed to my reserved nature, noticed nothing different. On the inside, however, a decision was taking shape, slow, firm, and irreversible. Because this 84-year-old man, treated as a disposable burden by his own son, still held onto something Mike had completely forgotten, something that would change everything, something that would transform that careless contempt into a regret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And when the right moment came, the disrespect of that afternoon would exact a price no one in the family was prepared to pay. What my son did not know, what Sarah, with her big city superiority complex, could not imagine, was who Robert Miller really was. Not the weak and dependent old man they had shipped off like annoying luggage, but the man I had been for 50 years before retiring and choosing a quiet life in upstate New York. the man whose past remained carefully hidden, not out of shame, but because of a deliberate decision to leave that life behind. Because while my son saw me as a financial burden, he had no idea he was kicking out a man who, at the peak of his career, managed the equivalent of $40 million in real estate assets all over the country. A man who had not only survived but thrived in the brutal American real estate market of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. A man who had built, bought, sold, and profited in a way that Mike, with his comfortable corporate job, would never understand. But that was only the beginning of the story, a story that was about to unfold in a way that would make my son regret ever saying those cold words that morning in New York City. I must go back a bit so you can fully understand who I am and why Mike's attitude was not only cruel, but spectacularly ignorant. My story does not begin as a lonely old man in an upstate town. It begins in Boston in 1958, when I was barely 20 years old and the world was rebuilding itself after decades of hardship. I was born into a modest family. My father was a factory worker. My mother sewed clothes at home to supplement our scarce family income. I grew up watching my parents work to the point of exhaustion just to put food on the table, to pay the rent for the small apartment we shared with my two siblings. I learned early on that life gives nothing for free, that every penny must be earned with sweat and intelligence. At 16, I started working as an assistant in an architectural firm. I made coffee, organized blueprints, carried documents back and forth, but I observed. I observed everything, how the architects talked to clients, how they presented projects, how they negotiated prices. I especially observed the conversations about land, about values, about the real estate market that was beginning to heat up in post-war America. That was where I had my first major realization. Property was power, land was wealth, and in a country that was modernizing, whoever knew how to spot opportunities could completely change their life. So I started studying. I spent entire nights at the public library reading about the real estate market, legislation, and urban development, while the guys my age were at the local bars drinking beer and flirting. I was calculating the value of square footage and studying city master plans. At 23, using every dollar I had saved from 5 years of work, I bought my first property. It was nothing glamorous, a small, run-down apartment in a working-class neighborhood in Boston, in a building that always seemed to be one step away from collapsing. But I had done my research. I knew that area was going to be revitalized, that a new bus line was planned, and that a school would be built nearby. I bought it for $4,000. I renovated it myself on the weekends. I sold it 2 years later for a profit of $6,000, a fortune for me at the time. And that is how it all started. I used the profit to buy 2 more apartments. I renovated, sold, and reinvested. I bought an entire small building, turned it into apartments, and sold them separately. Every operation was meticulously planned. I did not gamble. I did not take risks. I calculated, researched, and waited for the right moment. While other speculators went bankrupt in volatile markets, I grew steadily, year after year. It was during one of those negotiations in 1962 that I met Grace. She was the daughter of a public notary in Boston. She worked in her father's office registering properties. Beautiful, smart, with those brown eyes that seemed to see right through any facade. We fell in love during a particularly complicated transaction that involved 3 properties and 4 different parties. She admired my determination, my work ethic, and my vision. I admired her intelligence, her natural elegance, and her ability to keep my feet on the ground when ambition threatened to take me too far. We got married in 1964. Grace did not just support me, she became my business partner. She understood the legal side better than anyone. She knew every detail of the bureaucracy. She knew exactly how to structure every transaction to maximize profits and minimize risks. Together, we were unstoppable. During the 60s and 70s, we expanded beyond Boston. We bought properties in Chicago, in Miami when it was just starting to develop as a major tourist destination. We invested in Palm Beach when prices were still reasonable. We bought commercial buildings in New York City when companies were moving from the center to new neighborhoods. Always ahead of the trends, always calculating 2 or 3 steps ahead. In 1968, Mike was born, our joy, our pride. I remember holding him for the first time at the Boston hospital, that tiny, helpless being, and promising myself that he would have everything I never had: a quality education, opportunities, financial security, that he would never have to work with his hands bleeding from the cold like my father did, that he would never see his mother sew late into the night under a dim light like mine had done. And I kept that promise. Mike attended the best private schools in Boston. He had piano lessons, tennis lessons, summer trips. When he wanted to study in New York City at the prestigious Columbia University, I paid the $90,000 in annual tuition without hesitation, plus the apartment, plus spending money. When he graduated and wanted to get a master's degree at NYU, I financed it entirely. When he married Sarah and needed money for the down payment on the apartment on the Upper East Side, I transferred $100,000, no questions asked. But while I gave him everything materially, I realized too late that I had failed to pass on the values that truly mattered. Mike grew up accustomed to comfort, but without understanding the sacrifice that had built that comfort. He saw the results of my work, the properties, the money, but he never truly understood the work itself, the sleepless nights worrying about financing, the calculated risks that could have ruined us if they went wrong, the decades of iron discipline, every penny accounted for and intelligently invested. I officially retired a couple of years later, not because I had to, but because Grace was sick, and I wanted to spend every possible moment with her. I sold most of the commercial properties. I consolidated the investments. I simplified. I kept some strategic residential properties that generated a comfortable passive income. I transferred the management to specialized firms and settled down with Grace in Willow Creek, a town we had always loved, where we could live our final years in peace. What Mike never knew, because he never cared to ask, was what exactly I had done during all those years. To him, I was just Dad, someone who had enough money to pay for his expensive education and his comfortable lifestyle. He never asked questions about my work. He never showed curiosity about how that wealth had been built. When I occasionally tried to share stories from the past, he listened with distracted politeness before changing the subject to talk about his own ambitions and achievements. And so, over the years, Mike developed a completely distorted image of who I was. In his mind, I was just a retired old man, living on a modest pension in an upstate town. He saw the simple house in Willow Creek. He saw my discreet lifestyle. He saw my plain clothes and my modest habits, and assumed that I was, financially speaking, insignificant, a potential burden when old age arrived. What he did not know, because he never asked, and because I deliberately never said, was that this retired old man still owned a real estate portfolio valued at approximately $30,000 in monthly income, carefully selected properties in Boston, Chicago, Miami, and New York City that generated a massive passive income, investments in real estate funds and blue-chip stocks held across 3 different banks, with a total liquidity of roughly $2 million. My son thought he was throwing out a poor, dependent old man. In reality, he was expelling a man with a superior net worth, a man who could buy his precious apartment on the Upper East Side 3 times over and still have change left over. But I had chosen to live simply, not out of necessity, but by choice. After Grace's death, money lost much of its meaning. She was my partner, my motivation for building that empire. Without her, what mattered was living with dignity and peace, not showing off wealth. I kept the modest lifestyle because it was authentic, because it was what made me feel connected to my roots, to the memories of my hardworking parents. And also, I must admit, because I wanted to see who my son really was. When Grace was alive, she always defended Mike. She always said he was a good boy deep down, just spoiled and immature. But after she was gone, I started observing more closely. The rare, rushed visits, the phone calls that always seemed to have a hidden agenda, the sudden interest whenever I mentioned anything related to finances or inheritance. Now, when I fell ill and needed help, a part of me wanted to believe Grace was right, that my son would welcome me not for the money, but out of filial love, that natural kindness would prevail over the materialism I feared I had unintentionally cultivated in him. That trip to New York City was, in hindsight, a test that Mike failed spectacularly. Because when he said, "You are no longer my problem, Dad," when he threw me out like annoying trash, he did not just break my heart. He sealed his own financial fate in a way he did not yet understand. During those 3 nights at the downtown hotel near the bus terminal, I barely slept. Not because of the uncomfortable mattress or the street noises, but because my mind was working, planning, deciding. Years of business experience had taught me that emotion and business do not mix, that important decisions must be made with a cool head and meticulous planning. And that was exactly what I did. The first night I grieved. I let the pain wash over me, the sadness of realizing that my son, my only son, the boy I held in my arms and promised to protect, had become a man capable of such careless cruelty. I cried for the first time since Grace's funeral, the silent tears of a lonely old man in a miserable hotel room. The second night, I analyzed. I mentally reviewed every interaction with Mike over the last few years, every conversation, every visit. I recognized the patterns I had chosen to ignore, the questions about my financial situation, the sudden interest whenever I mentioned a property or investment, the way Sarah would jump into conversations when money was mentioned. They were not worried about me, they were worried about the inheritance. And now, concluding that this inheritance would be insignificant, they had discarded me. The third night, I planned. And what I planned was not impulsive revenge or blind rage. It was justice. A cold, calculated, and absolutely legal justice. A lesson my son would never forget. The next morning, before taking the bus back to Willow Creek, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Attorney Davis, my lawyer in Boston, a 68-year-old man who had handled my legal affairs for 30 years. I scheduled a meeting for the following week. The second was to my accountant, Mr. Harris, asking him to prepare full documentation of my entire estate. The third was to my wealth manager at Chase, requesting updated statements for all accounts and investments. When I returned to Willow Creek, I did not come back as a defeated old man. I came back as a man with a plan. Over the following weeks, I kept my routine absolutely normal. I greeted the neighbors, bought bread, and drank coffee at the exact same time. Frank commented that I looked calmer, more at peace than before the trip to the city. I smiled and said that sometimes things have to happen to show us what truly matters. What he did not know was that every afternoon, after coffee, I went home and worked. I reviewed documents, made discreet calls, and organized papers. Because what I was about to do required absolute precision. There could be no mistakes, no legal loopholes, no way for Mike to contest or reverse it. The meeting with Attorney Davis was revealing. We sat in his office, overlooking downtown Boston, surrounded by shelves full of legal codes, and I discussed my situation. He listened carefully, taking occasional notes, his experienced face revealing no judgment, only professional attention. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and remained silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, choosing his words carefully. "Robert, what you are describing perfectly fits the legal concept of manifest ingratitude in estate law. A child who demonstrates severe and unjustified ingratitude can legally be disinherited. But," he paused, "we must document everything meticulously, every instance of abandonment, every cruel word, every refusal of assistance. The courts take this very seriously, but they also demand substantial proof. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Proof. I had proof. I explained to Attorney Davis the text messages Mike had sent me over the years, the email threads where he refused visits or postponed commitments. I even had, and this was a last-minute decision before leaving New York City, a secret recording of that final conversation in his apartment, captured using my old cell phone. Recording conversations without consent can be legally complex in some places, but when it comes to the protection of a senior citizen's rights, courts tend to be much more flexible. Attorney Davis also smiled, that thin smile of a lawyer who sees a solid case forming. Then we are going to build a case that no judge will be able to ignore, and we are going to ensure that your estate goes exactly where you truly wish, not to someone who simply expects to inherit by biology. During the following months, we worked meticulously. We gathered all the documentation. We prepared a new will that completely excluded Mike from the inheritance, citing manifest ingratitude with all the attached evidence. We designated alternative beneficiaries, charities, people who had shown genuine care, but I did not want to simply disinherit him quietly. That would be too easy, too quick. Mike would live his life without even knowing what he had lost until my death, potentially decades in the future. No, I wanted him to know. I wanted him to live with the knowledge of what his cruelty had cost him. So I planned something more elaborate. I began planting seeds in casual conversations with mutual acquaintances. I would mention my difficult financial situation in passing. I would subtly complain about the cost of living, about how my pension was not enough. I let concerns about the future slip out. These conversations, I knew, would eventually reach Mike's ears through the network of gossip that exists in every community. Simultaneously, I started making small, visible transactions that would seem to confirm financial struggles. I switched my bank to a basic fee-free account at Wells Fargo. I started shopping at discount stores instead of the more expensive markets. I canceled my newspaper subscription and started buying day-old papers. Small gestures that, to anyone watching, painted the picture of a man with dwindling resources. All of this while my millions of dollars continued to grow silently in accounts and investments Mike did not know existed. I also started documenting every non-contact, every birthday that passed without a phone call, every major holiday where I received not even a single text message, every time I called and it went straight to voicemail or was answered with rushed, one-word replies. Attorney Davis instructed me to keep a detailed journal, and I did so religiously. 3 months after my eviction from New York City, Mike finally called, not to apologize, not to check on how I was doing, but because, according to him, he was organizing paperwork and needed to confirm some details about properties he thought I owned, properties that, in his imagination, would be his someday. The conversation was revealing. He asked specifically about the house in Willow Creek, about its estimated value, about whether there was a mortgage. He asked about other real estate I might have. His voice had that forced, casual tone of someone fishing for information while trying to sound disinterested. I answered his questions with carefully constructed half-truths. I said the house was worth maybe $200,000, a value substantially below its real appraisal of $500,000. I sighed convincingly and commented on how expensive life was getting for a single retiree. I could practically hear the relief in his voice. The confirmation that his old father was not a significant financial obstacle, that he had no hidden wealth, that he was exactly what he appeared to be, an ordinary pensioner struggling to survive. The call ended quickly after that, with Mike claiming urgent commitments. And I smiled, because every word of that conversation was recorded. More evidence for the growing file. It was around this time that I began frequenting the local senior community center more regularly. Not because I needed assistance, but because I wanted to observe. I wanted to see other elderly people, how they were treated by their families, how some were visited regularly by devoted children, while others languished in oblivion. And also, I admit, because the loneliness was beginning to weigh heavily. That was where I met Eleanor Campbell. a 76-year-old widow with bright blue eyes and a sharp sense of humor that made me laugh for the first time in months. She had also been abandoned by her family, a daughter who had moved to the West Coast and rarely called. We found comfort in each other, not exactly a romance, but genuine companionship, someone to share coffee and conversations with, someone who understood the particular loneliness of being forgotten by one's own children. Eleanor became my confidant. I told her everything about Mike, about my past, about the plan. She listened without judgment, only nodded with understanding, and said something I will never forget. "Robert, you must do what is right for you. We have not lived this long to waste our final years worrying about people who do not worry about us. And if your son needs to learn a hard lesson, better that he learns it while you are still here to see it." She was right, and her friendship gave me the strength to carry on with the plan. 6 months after my eviction, my 85th birthday arrived, an important milestone. I woke up that day expecting, despite everything, some contact from Mike. Maybe a text message, maybe even a call. It would be too much to ask, apparently. The day passed. No message, no call, no sign at all. Eleanor organized a small dinner for me with some friends from the community center. It was lovely, warm, and authentic. But that night, alone in the house, staring at the silent phone, I felt the final piece of the plan fall into place. Because at that moment, I finally accepted a truth I had been denying myself. My son would not change. There was no redemption waiting. There was no moment of clarity where he would realize his mistake. Mike was exactly who he proved to be, a man who valued comfort and convenience above family, who viewed relationships through transactional lenses, who simply did not possess the capacity for empathy or gratitude that I had hoped to cultivate in him. And once I accepted that, the guilt I still felt about disinheriting him evaporated. It was not revenge. It was a consequence. It was teaching a lesson that maybe, just maybe, would make him a better person in the future. The next morning, I called Attorney Davis and told him I was ready to finalize everything. We set a meeting for the following week where I would sign the final documents. The will was a legal masterpiece. It specifically excluded Mike, citing the specific legal statutes regarding manifest ingratitude and documenting 16 separate instances, each with attached evidence. The estate would be divided as follows: 40% to charities that support abandoned seniors, 30% to Eleanor Campbell, who had shown me more compassion in 6 months than my son had in a year, 20% to create an educational fund for children from low-income families in Boston, honoring my roots, and 10% divided among employees and acquaintances who had shown authentic kindness over the years. And the document included a special clause, a sealed letter that would be delivered to Mike at the time of the reading of the will, explaining exactly why he had been excluded, detailing every instance of cruelty, and revealing for the first time the true extent of the wealth he had lost by treating his father like garbage. I signed the documents on a sunny September afternoon, with Attorney Davis and 2 notaries serving as witnesses. When I walked out of the office, I felt a giant weight lifted off my shoulders. Justice had been served, legally and irrevocably, but it was not over yet, because I wanted Mike to know, but not just yet. I wanted to wait, to observe, to see if perhaps, miraculously, he would change. And also, I admit, because a sadistic part of me wanted him to continue believing the lie, to continue making his greedy plans based on false information, only to have everything collapse spectacularly when the truth finally emerged. The following months were peaceful. I lived my simple life in Willow Creek, spent time with Eleanor, read books, and walked around town as much as my legs allowed. My health stabilized. Dr. Adams said I could easily have another 10 years if I kept taking proper care of myself, and for the first time in a long time, I felt authentic peace. Mike called occasionally, short and superficial conversations where he asked about my health with a clinical interest rather than a filial one. I always said I was doing okay, struggling but surviving. Every conversation reinforced his belief that he was dealing with an ordinary old man with no significant resources. It was during one of those phone calls, almost a year after my eviction, that Mike let slip something revealing. He casually mentioned that he was considering expanding the apartment on the Upper East Side, maybe buying the neighboring unit when it became available. He commented that it would be a good consolidation of wealth for the future. The subtext was obvious. He was planning his financial future based on an inheritance that no longer existed. I smiled bitterly after that call. Soon, very soon, all that presumption would collapse. What Mike also did not know was that I had started taking additional steps to guarantee my legacy. Besides the will, I began making lifetime donations to the charities I planned to benefit. Not huge amounts that would draw attention, but regular and significant donations. I also built personal relationships with these organizations, visiting them, meeting the people, seeing the work they did. One of these organizations was Hope for Seniors, a facility in Boston that cared for abandoned elderly people with no resources. I visited their facilities during a trip to Boston to meet with Attorney Davis. What I saw broke my heart and reinforced my decision. Dozens of old people, some even older than me, living in simple but dignified rooms, receiving care from a devoted but overworked staff. So many of them had been discarded by their families, just as it had almost happened to me. I spoke with the director, Mr. Thompson, a 50-year-old man with prematurely gray hair and tired but kind eyes. I told him my story without revealing the financial figures involved, just the essence. He nodded with a sad understanding. It is more common than people imagine, Mr. Miller. We live in an era where the elderly are seen as burdens instead of treasures of wisdom and experience. Families get rid of parents the same way they get rid of old furniture. That was when I made an additional decision. When I passed away, besides the substantial donation from the will, I would leave instructions for part of the money to be used to build a new wing at the facility. A comfortable, dignified wing where abandoned elderly people could live their final years with respect and care. And that wing would bear the name of the Grace Miller Wing, honoring the woman who always valued family and care above everything else. When I told Eleanor about this that week, she cried, tears of sadness for the cruelty of the world, but also of joy because something good would emerge from my pain. Your son might have lost a father, Robert, but dozens of old people will gain dignity thanks to you. That is a legacy worth leaving. She was right, and for the first time since Grace's death, I felt that my life still had a purpose. It still had meaning beyond mere survival. Because while I was building this positive legacy, Mike was about to make a mistake that would dramatically accelerate the timeline of the revelation I had planned. It was in January, almost 15 months after my eviction from New York City, that I received a certified letter. Not from my son directly, but from a law firm in the city. My heart raced as I opened it. Inside, I found legal documents requesting that I sign a power of attorney, giving Mike total control over my financial and medical affairs. The attached letter, signed by a lawyer I had never met, explained in cold and professional language that given my advanced age and health conditions, it would be prudent and responsible to transfer legal control to a younger family member who could guarantee my best interests. There was also a mention of facilitating eventual difficult medical decisions and consolidating estate matters for future efficiency. I read the documents 3 times, the anger growing with each read. This was not filial concern. This was an attempt to take legal control of the assets Mike believed I had, however modest they might be. It was also potentially the first step toward a conservatorship, declaring me incapable of managing my own affairs. I took a deep breath. I forced the anger to dissipate. It was replaced by something colder and more useful, a calculated determination, because Mike had just given me the perfect pretext for the final revelation. I immediately called Attorney Davis. I explained the situation. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then a heavy sigh. "Robert, this is serious. This demonstrates not only disinterest or negligence, but active predatory action. This immensely reinforces the case of manifest ingratitude, and it also—" He paused. "Means that perhaps we should not wait any longer to act." I agreed. We discussed the options. We decided on a plan that would be simultaneously devastating for Mike and absolutely legal and irrefutable. The strategy would be as follows. I would respond to the letter from Mike's lawyer with a polite rejection, but I would make it clear that I was seriously considering the matter and that I needed more time to think and consult with my own legal advisors. This would give Mike false hope, making him believe he was making progress in his attempt to gain control. Meanwhile, Attorney Davis would initiate the process to declare me completely competent, both mentally and physically, through comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations. This would create irrefutable documentation that I was in full control of my faculties, making any future attempt at a conservatorship impossible. Simultaneously, we would transfer all my assets into a more protected legal structure, a trust fund managed alongside Eleanor and 3 trusted trustees. This guaranteed that even if Mike somehow obtained a power of attorney, there would be nothing left under my direct personal name to control, only rights within the trust that he could not touch. And finally, we would prepare a spectacular revelation. We would not wait for my death for Mike to find out, but confront him while I was still alive, with witnesses, with documentation, with the complete truth, forcing him to face exactly what his greed and cruelty had cost him. Attorney Davis loved the plan. It is bold, it is dramatic, but it is absolutely legal and defensible. You will have your justice, Robert, and your son will get a lesson he will never forget. During the following weeks, we executed every step meticulously. I went through full medical evaluations at the regional hospital. A neurologist, a psychiatrist, and a general practitioner all concluded the same thing. Robert Miller, at 85 years old, was in full possession of his mental faculties, oriented in time and space, and capable of making rational and independent decisions. The reports were attached to the legal file. Simultaneously, we restructured all the assets, the properties, the investments, the bank accounts. Everything was transferred to the Grace Trust Fund, named in honor of my late wife. The trustees were Eleanor, Attorney Davis, Mr. Thompson from Hope for Seniors, and my old friend and former business associate, Teresa Carter, an 81-year-old woman who had worked with me for decades and remained loyal over the years. Every transfer was documented, registered, and notarized. There was nothing Mike could contest as being done under coercion or diminished mental capacity. Meanwhile, I responded to his lawyer's letter exactly as planned. I said that I was seriously considering the proposal and that I needed to consult with my doctors and advisors before making such an important decision. I suggested that perhaps we could discuss it in person in a few weeks. The response came quickly. Mike called personally for the first time in months, his voice injected with a fake paternal concern that would have been comical if it were not so repulsive. He said he was relieved that I was being sensible about the situation, that he just wanted to ensure I was protected, and that everything was handled correctly. I played the role perfectly, the trembling voice of a confused old man. I thanked him for his concern. I said I really needed help understanding all of this. I scheduled a meeting for 3 weeks later at a notary's office in Stamford, Connecticut, halfway between upstate New York and the city. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. He thought he was winning. He thought he would finally gain control over the few assets he imagined I had. Poor guy. He had no idea what was about to happen. The 3 weeks passed in meticulous preparation. Attorney Davis prepared a complete presentation, documenting every piece of evidence of his ingratitude. We had recordings, emails, text messages, testimonies from neighbors about the abandonment, and medical reports showing that I had to take care of myself despite my physical difficulties. We had the complete timeline from my eviction from New York City to his recent attempt to take legal control. We also prepared a second presentation, this one detailing my entire estate. Every property, every investment, every account, updated values, and full documentation. The shocking truth that Mike was about to discover. We invited witnesses to the meeting, not just the notary, but also a court official to guarantee that everything was perfectly official and recorded. Attorney Davis would be present, of course. Eleanor, too, for moral support, and in a touch that I particularly appreciated, Mr. Thompson from Hope for Seniors to represent the true beneficiaries of my estate. On the scheduled day, I arrived at the notary's office in Stamford an hour early. The office was in a historic brick building downtown. It had that characteristic smell of old documents and furniture wax that all law offices seem to have. Attorney Davis was already there, organizing documents. Eleanor arrived shortly after, held my hand, and whispered, "Courage, Robert. Justice will be served today." At exactly 4 in the afternoon, Mike arrived. He came alone, which was interesting. Sarah did not come. He walked into the office with the arrogant confidence of someone who believes they are in control of the situation. He wore an expensive suit, carried an Italian leather briefcase, and had that air of a successful big city executive, doing a favor for a confused old man. When he saw me, he forced a smile, stepped forward, and tried to hug me. I subtly stepped back and shook his hand formally. I noticed a flash of irritation in his eyes before he recomposed his mask of filial concern. "Dad, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know these things can be confusing, but I am here to help." Confusing? As if I were senile, incapable of understanding my own affairs. I took a deep breath. I forced myself to stay calm. It was not time yet. "Sit down, Mike. There is something we need to discuss before signing anything." He sat down. His confidence was unshakable. The notary, Mr. Morgan, a stern 60-year-old man with gold-rimmed glasses, sat at the head of the table. Attorney Davis sat next to me. Eleanor was on my other side, and the court official sat to the side, silent but present. Mike looked around, finally registering that there were more people than expected. "Dad, is this really necessary? I thought this would just be a simple conversation between us." It was Attorney Davis who answered, his voice professional and firm. "Mr. Miller, your father requested that this meeting be official and fully documented. Everyone present is here at his request, and for specific purposes that will soon become clear." I saw Mike swallow hard, the first crack appearing in his facade of confidence, but he quickly recovered. He nodded as if it were no big deal. "Of course, if that is what you want." Mr. Morgan formally opened the session, stating the date, the time, those present, and the purpose of the meeting. Then he signaled for me to begin. I looked at my son, that face that had once belonged to an innocent boy, now hardened by greed and indifference, and I started to speak. "Mike, you called me here today, believing that I would sign documents giving you control over my affairs. You sent letters through lawyers, using intimidating legal language, all based on the assumption that I am a confused old man who needs to be managed." I paused. "But before we discuss that, there is something you need to know. Things you should have asked years ago, but never cared enough to ask." I gestured to Attorney Davis, who opened the first file. He pulled out a set of documents and spread them across the table. "These are medical and psychological evaluations completed over the last 3 weeks. A neurologist, a psychiatrist, and a general practitioner. They all attest that I am in perfect mental health, fully capable of making my own decisions. You can read every report if you want." Mike took the documents, his eyes scanning them quickly. I saw the confusion grow on his face. Dad, this is great, but I do not understand. Why? You will understand. Attorney Davis, please present the second set. More documents were placed on the table, this time a thick file. Mike looked at it blankly. This, I began, is a complete record of our relationship over the last 7 years. Every visit, or lack thereof. Every phone call, or lack thereof. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment I needed help, and you were not there. I opened the file. I pulled out page after page. Here's the documentation from the time you kicked me out of your apartment 15 months ago, including, I turned a page, a recording of the conversation where you said, and I quote, "You are no longer my problem, Dad." I watched the color drain from Mike's face. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Here is, I continued relentlessly, the documentation from the last 7 years. Since your mother died, you have visited me exactly 4 times. 4 times in 7 years. You have called 17 times. Most of those calls lasted less than 5 minutes. I flipped to another section. Here's the documentation of all the times you called asking about financial matters, about properties, about a potential inheritance. 23 calls about money, 17 about my actual life. Interesting ratio, do you not think? Dad, I was busy. You know, the city. Work. Busy. Of course. Too busy to visit your sick elderly father, but not too busy to try and take legal control over his affairs when you thought there might be something to gain. I turned to Attorney Davis. Please present the third set. These documents were different, thicker, more official. Mike looked at them with growing alarm. This, I announced, is my new will. Registered, notarized, absolutely legal and irrefutable. Under the state statutes that allow disinheritance for manifest ingratitude, you have been completely removed as a beneficiary of any part of my estate. The silence that followed was absolute. Mike turned as white as a sheet, his eyes fixed on the documents as if he could not believe what he was reading. How? You cannot do this. I am your son. You are my son biologically, but you stopped being my son in any meaningful way a long time ago, and the law recognizes this. Attorney Davis took control, his voice legal and impassive. Mike, your father has presented substantial evidence of parental abandonment, negligence, and attempted financial exploitation. All of this qualifies as grounds for disinheritance under state law. The will has been reviewed by legal experts and is considered completely valid. I watched Mike processing this. I saw the realization begin to set in. But there was still more to come. Much more. But, I continued, there is something else you need to know. Something that will make this decision even more shocking for you. I made a gesture, and Attorney Davis produced the last set of documents. The big one. The final revelation. You see, Mike, you made your decisions based on false assumptions about my financial situation. You saw me as a poor, retired old man living on a modest pension in an upstate town, someone with maybe a house and some modest savings, someone who was not worth the effort to take care of, but also did not have much to leave behind in an inheritance. I opened the main document. I turned it around so he could see it. But that assumption was completely, spectacularly false. And then I presented the truth. Property by property, investment by investment, account by account. This apartment building in Boston, this commercial building in Chicago, these 3 properties in Miami, combined, this penthouse in New York City, 5 blocks away from yours, by the way. I read systematically, watching Mike's eyes grow wider and wider, the understanding and horror growing. Investments in real estate funds, diversified blue-chip stocks, accounts at Chase, Bank of America, and Citibank. I paused. I let the information sink in, then delivered the final blow. Total net worth, updated last week, $12,500,000. The silence was deafening. Mike was frozen, his mouth open, his eyes fixed on the numbers. I could see his mind working frantically, processing, recalculating everything he thought he knew. Over $12 million, I repeated. built over 50 years of hard work, smart investments, and sacrifice. Money I used to give you the best education, to finance your master's degree, to help you with your apartment. Money you assumed did not exist, because you never cared to ask, because you never saw your father as anything more than an annoying old man. I saw tears begin to form in his eyes, but they were not tears of regret. They were tears of realization for what he had lost. And I continued relentlessly. This money will go to places where it will be truly valued. 40% to charities that care for abandoned seniors. 30% to Eleanor Campbell, who has shown me more kindness in 1 year than you have in a decade. I pointed to each person in the room. 20% for an educational fund for low-income children in Boston. 10% divided among others who have shown authentic care. These people, Mike, strangers compared to you, will receive what you threw away. Finally, Mike found his words, though they came out strangled and desperate. Dad, please, I made mistakes, I know. But we can fix this. We can fix it. I raised my voice for the first time. You threw me out of your house like garbage. You told me I was no longer your problem. You spent 7 years ignoring me after your mother died. And then, only when you thought you could profit, you tried to take legal control over me through manipulation and intimidation. And you want to fix this? I was confused. Sarah said that. Do not you dare blame your wife. You are a grown man. You made your choices, and now you will live with the consequences. Attorney Davis leaned forward. Mike, you must understand that this decision is final and legally irrevocable. Any attempt to contest it will not only fail, but it will result in the public exposure of all the evidence of negligence and attempted exploitation, including, he paused significantly, possible criminal charges for attempted fraud regarding the power of attorney you tried to obtain under false pretenses. That broke Mike. He collapsed in his chair, his face buried in his hands, sobbing, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sadness, no anger, just a cold emptiness where paternal love should have been. I let him cry for a moment, then spoke one last time, my voice calm and final. You will have one last chance, Mike. Not to recover the inheritance, that is lost, and rightfully so, but to perhaps, just perhaps, recover some shreds of dignity. He lifted his tear-stained face. What? Anything, Dad. In the years I have left, you can try to be the son you should have been, not for the money. That ship has sailed, but for the simple act of doing the right thing. Regular visits, not because you expect something, but because I am your father. Authentic phone calls asking how I am, not about finances. Real care if I need it. I paused. I let it sink in. If you do that genuinely, without expectations, then maybe, just maybe, in my final moments, I will remember you as something more than the person who betrayed me. That is the only inheritance I can still offer you. The opportunity to prove that there is goodness in you, even if it appears too late. Mike nodded frantically, the words coming out in a desperate torrent. Yes, yes, I will, I promise. I will be better, I swear. Time will tell. Until then, these documents are registered. This will is in effect, and this meeting is over. Mr. Morgan, who had witnessed everything in professional silence, nodded. The minutes will be registered in the county archives. Everyone present will sign as witnesses. Mike, you have the right to a copy of all the documents presented today. Mike just nodded weakly, crushed by the weight of the revelation. I stood up slowly, my old bones protesting. Eleanor held my arm, supporting me. I looked at my son one last time. I loved you, Mike. I gave you everything, and you threw it away out of pure greed and indifference. May this lesson, as expensive as it is, make you a better man. It is the last thing I can do for you. And then I walked out of that office, Eleanor by my side, leaving my son sitting among piles of documents that detailed exactly what his cruelty had cost him. The months following that meeting in Stamford were revealing in many ways. Mike, to give him credit, really tried to keep his promise. He started calling weekly, conversations that were awkward and forced at first, but gradually became a bit more natural. He visited Willow Creek 3 times in the first 2 months, something unprecedented in the last 7 years, but I could see it in his eyes, in the way he looked at the modest house, in how he asked subtle questions about my health. A part of him was still hoping that maybe, somehow, I would change my mind, that the will was not really final, that there was some way to recover what was lost, and every time I saw that hope in his eyes, it reaffirmed my decision, because his change in behavior did not come from genuine regret or rediscovered filial love. It came from fear and self-interest. It came from the desperation of a man who realized too late what he had lost. Eleanor, who had become my constant companion, helped me navigate those difficult months. She understood my pain in a way few could. She had also been abandoned by her daughter. She had also felt that particular betrayal of one's own blood. We spent our afternoons in my backyard, drinking coffee, talking about life, memories, and plans for the future. A future that, ironically, felt more hopeful now that I had cut the toxic tie with my son than when I lived in the illusion that we had a real relationship. You know, Eleanor told me one afternoon as we watched the sunset over the upstate hills, your story needs to be told, not for revenge, but as a warning, for parents who are raising children so they do not make the same mistakes, and for children so they see the consequences of taking their parents for granted. She was right, and that conversation planted a seed that would eventually lead me to share this story. Because if my experience can save even one father-son relationship, if it can make even one ungrateful child reconsider their behavior, then all this pain will have had some purpose beyond my own justice. Mr. Thompson from Hope for Seniors came to visit me 3 months after the meeting in Stamford. He brought architectural blueprints for the new wing we were going to build, the Grace Miller Wing. It would be a beautiful, dignified space, with spacious rooms full of natural light, common areas for socializing, and therapeutic gardens. This, he told me, spreading the blueprints across my dining table, will change lives, Robert. Dozens of seniors who would otherwise end up in deplorable situations will have a dignified place to live their final years. Your wife would be proud. Tears rolled down my cheeks when I saw the blueprints. Grace really would be proud. She always valued helping others. She always believed in using our wealth to do good. And now, even after her death, her name would be associated with something beautiful and meaningful. Now, almost 2 years after that devastating meeting in Stamford, I sit in my backyard in Willow Creek. At 86 years old, I reflect on how everything unfolded. Mike still calls, he still visits, but the relationship is different now. There are no more pretenses, no more false hopes. We both know exactly where we stand. The last time he came, 3 weeks ago, we had a conversation I never thought we would have. We were sitting in this very backyard drinking coffee when he finally said the words I had been waiting to hear for 2 years. Dad, I need to tell you something, and I do not want you to think it is because I hope to change your decision, because I already understand that is not going to happen. And it is fine. It is perfectly fine. I deserved it. He looked up, his eyes finally showing something that looked like genuine regret. I was a terrible son, not just in these last few years, but for a long time. I focused so much on my life, on my career, on accumulating things that I forgot what really mattered. I forgot that I had a father who sacrificed everything to give me opportunities he never had. He paused, the tears flowing freely now. When Mom died, I should have been there for you, not just for 2 days at the funeral, but through the whole grieving process. I should have recognized that you lost your lifelong companion and were left all alone, but I only thought about getting back to my comfortable life in the city. And when you needed help, when you were getting sick and asked for the bare minimum, not even a permanent place, just help finding solutions, I treated you like a nuisance, Like something ruining my plans. I threw you out on the street. His voice broke completely. I said you were no longer my problem, Dad. How could I say that? How could I reduce my own father, the man who gave me everything, to a problem that needed to be eliminated? I remained silent, letting him continue. And the worst part is that it was not even about you specifically. It was because Sarah was complaining that the apartment was too crowded, because my friends were starting to make comments about having my father living with us, because I cared more about my image and my comfort than your well-being. It was pure selfishness. He took a breath and continued. And then when I thought you might have some money, however small it might be, I immediately tried to take control. Not to help you, but to make sure it would eventually come to me. I did not even care if you were well taken care of. I just wanted to secure the inheritance. He wiped his tears. When you showed me those documents in Stamford, when I saw how much money you really had, my first reaction was not shame for how I had treated you. It was horror over how much I had lost, and that tells you everything you need to know about who I was. Was, I noted the verb tense. Was, he confirmed, because these 2 years have changed me, Dad, not because I hope to get the money back. I already understand that will not happen, and honestly, that is fine. They have changed me because I finally understood what I lost, which has nothing to do with dollars and cents. I lost the opportunity to truly know my father in his final years. I lost the wisdom you could have shared about business, about life, about how you built that empire from scratch. I lost the chance to take care of you, the way you took care of me when I was a child. And I lost the respect of a man I admire more than I ever allowed myself to admit. I looked at my son, this 58-year-old man crying in my backyard, and for the first time in years, I saw something of the boy I had raised. Not greed, not selfishness, but genuine vulnerability and real regret. Does Sarah know you are here? I asked. He nodded. Yes, she has changed too. Or maybe I changed, and that shifted our dynamic. I told her everything, the whole story from your perspective. At first she got defensive, said I was being dramatic. But I showed her the recordings, the documents, the evidence of how we treated you. She was in shock. I think that she, like me, never really saw you as a whole person, just as an annoying obligation. And when she saw it all documented, how we systematically rejected you for years, something changed in her too. We separated 6 months ago, he said quietly. Not just because of this, but this was part of a larger pattern. We realized we had built a life based on appearances and materialism without any real values, and when that foundation crumbles, everything falls apart. I was surprised, but I did not show it. How do you feel about it? Sad, but also relieved. We are being civilized about it, dividing everything fairly, and honestly, it is helping me reevaluate what I truly want out of life. There was a long silence. The afternoon sun painted the backyard in golden tones. Birds sang in the oak tree. The world moved on, indifferent to our family drama. I'm not going to change the will, Mike, I said finally. I know, Dad, and you shouldn't. I do not deserve it. But, I continued, I appreciate that you have finally found some honesty, that you can finally see beyond yourself. Is it too late to have some kind of real relationship? He asked, his voice hopeful but resigned. Not for inheritance, just as father and son, making the most of the time we have left. I considered it for a long moment. I do not know, Mike. The damage was deep. The trust was destroyed. But maybe if you keep visiting, if you continue being honest, if you stop seeing every visit as an opportunity to get something back and simply view it as time spent with your father, maybe we can build something, not what we had before, that is lost forever, but something new, something based on truth instead of obligation or expectation. His eyes lit up. I would like that, Dad. I would like that very much. Then come over when you can. Call when you want to talk. But do not do it for me, Mike. Do it because you truly want to. Because if I detect even a hint of fakeness, of a hidden agenda, it is over. Understood, understood, he said firmly. Eleanor arrived at the house shortly after Mike left that afternoon. She sat with me in the backyard. She took my hand. "How was the visit?" she asked. "Different," I admitted. For the first time, I felt like I was talking to a real human being, not an actor playing a role. "Do you think he has really changed?" "Time will tell. But at least now there is a possibility, however small it may be." Eleanor smiled. "Your Grace would be proud of you, you know, for keeping your dignity, for demanding respect, but also for leaving the door open for redemption." She was right. Grace always believed in second chances, in the power of forgiveness. But she also believed in justice, and that actions have consequences. The Grace Miller Wing was inaugurated 3 months ago. It was a beautiful ceremony, with the local mayor present. There was media coverage, and more importantly, dozens of seniors who would be the first residents of that dignified space. Mike attended the inauguration. He stayed in the back, not seeking attention, just observing. After the ceremony, he approached me. "This is incredible, Dad. Mom would be so proud." "I know," I said simply. "Can I?" He pointed toward the building. "Can I see the inside?" I nodded, and we walked through the facilities together. The rooms filled with natural light, the therapeutic gardens, the common areas where residents could socialize. Everything designed with dignity and respect in mind. "This is what money should do," Mike said quietly as we watched the residents settling in. "Not buy bigger apartments or more expensive cars. This, changing lives, creating dignity." I did not respond, but I felt something soften slightly in my chest. Now, sitting in my backyard, writing this story to share with the world, I reflect on the lessons learned. I built a $12 million real estate empire over 50 years. It was an achievement I was proud of. But that is not the legacy I want to be remembered for. I want to be remembered for maintaining my dignity when I was treated like garbage, for demanding respect when I was offered crumbs, for using my wealth to create something meaningful instead of simply passing it on to someone who would not value it. And now, if you will excuse me, Eleanor is arriving for our afternoon coffee, and there is a beautiful sunset waiting over the upstate hills. Life goes on, and in my final years, I am finally living in peace,